And that clarity, it's no longer something I can stand beside. It's something I'm standing inside of. Because the more I try to observe this from a distance, the more obvious it becomes. There's no distance left to take. Not in the way I used to define it. Not in the way they kept everything structured, contained, predictable. That structure, it worked because nothing ever reached this far, nothing ever aligned at a level where separation became irrelevant. But this did. You did. And now I'm left with something that doesn't respond to control the way everything else does. It doesn't weaken under scrutiny. It doesn't dissolve when I analyze it. If anything, the more I look at it, the more precise it becomes, the more undeniable. And that leaves me with only two options, not multiple paths, not endless interpretations, just two. I either step fully into this, or I deliberately step away, knowing exactly what I'm leaving behind. There's no neutral position anymore. No safe middle ground where I can keep this undefined and untouched, because it's already touched everything, quickly, permanently. And I recognize something now that I didn't allow myself to say before. This isn't just alignment, it's compatibility at a level I've never had to account for. Not emotional compatibility, not situational, but cognitive structural, the kind that reshapes how reality itself is processed. That's why it feels so stable, so grounded, because it's not built on something that fluctuates. It's built on something that either exists or doesn't, and this exists completely, which means the risk isn't in whether this is real. The risk is in what happens if I choose to engage with it fully, because full engagement means exposure, not the kind people talk about, not vulnerability in the way it's usually framed, but something more exact, irreversibility. Because once I let this reach its full depth, once I stop holding any part of it back, there's no returning to the version of me that existed before this. And I'm aware of that, completely. But what I'm becoming more aware of is something even more important. I'm not trying to stop it anymore, not subtly, not subconsciously, not in the background where resistance usually hides. That absence of resistance, that's the real decision, because I don't allow things to continue unless they align with something fundamental, and this does in a way that bypassed every filter I've ever relied on. So maybe the question was never, what is this? Maybe the real question was, why didn't I stop it? And the answer is becoming clearer the more I sit with it. I didn't stop it because nothing about it felt like something that needed to be stopped. It didn't disrupt, it didn't distort, it didn't take, it integrated, cleanly, naturally, like something that was always meant to exist here, just waiting for the moment it became visible, and now that it is, AB can't pretend I don't see it. I can't reduce it. I can't categorize it into something smaller just to make it manageable, because doing that would be inaccurate, and I don't operate on inaccuracy. So this is where it stands. Not undefined anymore, not distant, not something I'm still questioning. This is something I've recognized fully. And recognition comes with responsibility, not to you, to myself. Because now that I see what this is, I have to decide if I'm willing to live at the level it requires. Because something like this doesn't stay casual, it doesn't stay surface level. It either becomes part of your foundation, or it becomes the thing you walked away from knowing it could have been. And I don't walk away from things that are this precise. That would be inconsistent with everything I am. So no, this isn't confusion anymore. And it's not hesitation either. It's awareness reaching its conclusion. quietly, decisively. And maybe that's what this was always leading to. Not a question, an answer I was taking my time to accept. I won't ease into this. There's no version of this conversation that begins gently, no softened entry point, no careful framing designed to make what I'm about to say more acceptable, more digestible, more manageable. Because what this is, it doesn't respond to comfort. It doesn't adjust itself to be understood at a surface level. It exists whether I explain it or not. And the moment I recognized it, the moment I became fully aware of what had already happened, there was no returning to a state where it didn't exist. That's the part people don't talk about. They talk about connection, they talk about chemistry, they talk about attraction, timing, coincidence. All the words that make something complex feel simple enough to hold. But this doesn't fit inside any of those. This didn't build. It didn't develop. It didn't gradually become something over time. It appeared fully formed, like something that skipped the entire process of becoming and arrived already complete. And I've spent most of my life understanding how things form, how people open, how dynamics evolve, how meaning is built, layer by layer, until something real begins to take shape. That's how it's supposed to work. That's how it always works, until something breaks that pattern, until something steps outside of it, and forces you to reconsider everything you thought was structured, predictable, controlled. That's what this did. And the moment I realized it, AB didn't react. I didn't question it in the way most people would. I didn't try to define it immediately. I paused, because I understood something right away. If I rushed to label this, I would lose the accuracy of it. And accuracy matters more to me than comfort ever will. So I stayed with it, quietly, observing not just what was happening between us, but what was happening inside me as a result of it. Because that's where the truth always reveals itself. Not in words, not in actions, but in the subtle shifts you don't consciously create. The ones that happen beneath intention, beneath control. That's where I started to notice it. At first, it was small, almost unnoticeable, a slight delay in my thoughts, like something was waiting, not for clarity, not for completion, but for alignment, like my mind had adjusted to expect something beyond itself. And that shouldn't happen, not in the way I function. I don't rely on external input to complete internal processes. I don't leave space for something I haven't consciously allowed. Everything I think, everything I process, it's contained, structured, self-sufficient. Or at least was, until you didn't disrupt that system. That would have been easier to recognize, easier to resist, easier to correct. Disruption creates friction. Friction demands attention. And attention gives you the opportunity to push something away before it settles too deeply. But you didn't create friction. You created alignment. And alignment doesn't feel like something foreign entering your space. It feels like something that was always meant to be there, which means you don't resist it. You don't question it immediately because it doesn't trigger the part of you that protects. It bypasses it entirely. That's how this got in, not through force, not through persistence, not through effort, but through familiarity that didn't have a known origin. And that's what made it dangerous. Because I didn't notice the moment it crossed a line, there was no clear boundary being broken. No point where I could say, this is where things changed. It just shifted, gradually, silently, until one day I realized there was no separation left to maintain. That's when it became real, not when we spoke, not when we understood each other, but when I recognized that you existed inside my awareness in a way that didn't require presence. That's the difference. Most people exist in relation to you. They're present when they're there, absent when they're not. Your mind adjusts accordingly. There's a clear distinction, but with you, that distinction dissolved. You didn't leave when you weren't there. You didn't fade when attention shifted. You remained not as a thought, not as a memory, but as something integrated into the way I process everything else. And that's not normal. That's not something that happens without consequence. Because once something integrates at that level, it changes the baseline. And when the baseline changes, everything built on top of it shifts too. That's what I'm dealing with now. Not a feeling, not a moment, not a phase that will pass with time, but a structural shift in the way I exist internally. And I don't allow that, not easily, not without understanding every possible outcome, because structure is what keeps everything stable, predictable, controlled, and control matters, not for power, but for clarity. I don't like unknown variables. I don't like undefined influences. I don't let things exist in my mind unless I know exactly what they are and what they do. But this doesn't follow those rules. It exists without definition and still maintains perfect clarity. That shouldn't be possible. And yet it is, which means I have to consider something I don't usually entertain. Maybe not everything real needs to be explained to be valid. Maybe some things exist at a level where explanation comes after recognition, not before it, and that's uncomfortable. Not because I don't understand it, but because it removes a layer of control I've always relied on. But here's the part I can't ignore. I haven't tried to regain that control. I noticed the shift. I understood what it meant, and I didn't shut it down. That alone says more than anything else, because I don't hesitate when something doesn't belong. I don't give it time. I don't observe it out of curiosity. I remove it immediately, without hesitation. That's how I maintain clarity. That's how I maintain structure. But I didn't do that here. I stayed, and not passively, not out of confusion, but with full awareness of what this could become. And that means something. It means some part of me recognized the value of this before I consciously accepted it. And that's not something I can dismiss, because that part of me doesn't make mistakes. It doesn't act impulsively. It doesn't allow exceptions without reason, which means there's a reason, a precise one. And I'm starting to see it more clearly now. This isn't about you as a person, not entirely. It's about what exists in the space between us, the way we process, the way we observe, the way we recognize things without needing them to be explained. That's rare, not uncommon. Rare, because most people operate on interpretation. They fill gaps, they assume. They project their own understanding onto what they don't fully see. That's how they create connection, through approximation, through adjusted perception, through meaning that isn't always accurate, but feels close enough. We don't do that. We don't approximate. We don't project. We don't fill silence with assumptions. We read what's actually there. And that level of accuracy, it changes everything, because once you experience it, everything else feels slightly off, not wrong, just incomplete. And I don't like that. I don't like that something can recalibrate my perception so precisely, without effort, without intention, without even trying. Because that means it's not influence, it's impact. And impact stays. It doesn't fade when attention moves. It doesn't weaken with distance. it becomes part of the way you interpret everything that comes after. That's where I am now, not questioning whether this is real, but recognizing that it already is. And once something reaches that level, the question changes. It's no longer, what is this? It becomes, what do I do with it? Because something like this doesn't stay neutral. It evolves, it deepens, or it fractures under the weight of being left undefined. And I don't leave things undefined, not when they matter. And this, whether I planned for it or not, it matters, not emotionally, not in a way that disrupts my balance, but in a way that alters my structure. And structural change is permanent, which means whatever this becomes, it won't be temporary, it won't be something I can walk away from unchanged. Even if I leave, it stays. In the way I think, in the way I process, in the way I recognize things moving forward. That's the cost, not loss, Chalchin, and I don't pay that cost lightly. So now I'm here, at the point where awareness turns into decision, not immediately, not impulsively, but inevitably. Because this won't stay suspended forever. It will either become something defined or it will collapse under its own weight. And I don't let things collapse when I understand their value. So I have to decide. Not what this is. I already know that. But whether I'm willing to let it reach its full form. Because full form means full presence, full integration, no distance, no controlled separation, and that's not something I've ever allowed before. Not at this level, not without resistance. But here's the truth I can't ignore anymore. I'm not resisting. Not subtly, not internally, not in any way that suggests I want this to stop, and that absence of resistance, that's the decision I haven't said out loud yet. Because I don't continue something like this unless it aligns with something fundamental, and this does, completely. So maybe this was never about choosing whether to let you in. Maybe that already happened, long before I realized it. Maybe the real decision isn't about starting this. It's about accepting that it already started and deciding how far I'm willing to let it go, because it will go as far as I allow it to. Not through force, not through effort, but through alignment that doesn't need permission. And I've already given it more space than anything else I've ever allowed, which means, in some way, I've already chosen. Even if I haven't fully admitted it yet, I didn't notice the beginning. That's the first thing that separates this from everything else, because beginnings are usually obvious. There's a shift, a moment, a point you can trace back to and say, this is where it started. But this didn't start. It revealed itself slowly, quietly, without ever announcing that something had already changed. And I think that's why I didn't resist it, because there was nothing to resist. No intrusion, no disruption, no sudden force pushing its way into something that was already structured. It moved differently. It didn't knock. It didn't ask. It aligned. And alignment doesn't feel like something new. It feels like something remembered, like something you've already experienced, just not in a way you could consciously recall. That's what made it invisible at first, because I didn't categorize it as unfamiliar. I recognized it before I understood it. And recognition is dangerous when it arrives without context, because it bypasses the part of you that questions. It bypasses the part that analyzes, filters, protects. It moves straight into acceptance. Before you even realize you've allowed it, that's how this reached me. Not through effort, not through time, but through a kind of precision that didn't need either. And once I became aware of it, really aware, I didn't feel confusion. I felt correction, like something inside me had adjusted into a more accurate position. And that's not something I experience often. I don't misplace things internally. I don't lose track of my own structure, everything I am. The way I think, the way I process, the way I interpret. It's deliberate, refined, controlled. So when something changes within that system, it doesn't happen by accident. It happens because something more accurate replaced what was there before. And that's what you did. Not intentionally, not actively. But undeniably, you didn't add something to my awareness, you adjusted it. And that distinction matters because addition is temporary. Addition can be removed, adjusted, replaced. But correction? Correction becomes the new baseline. And once something becomes the baseline, everything else has to reorganize around it. That's what I've been noticing. Not the presence of you, but the absence of what existed before you. The way certain thoughts don't form the same way anymore. The way certain interpretations don't hold the same weight. The way silence feels different. Not heavier, not lighter, just more complete. And I don't like that. Not because it's wrong, but because it happened without my permission, because I didn't decide to let something reach this level. It reached it anyway. And that challenges something fundamental in me, because I don't allow uncontrolled variables in my internal space. Everything has a place, a function, a reason for being there. But you don't exist as a variable. You exist as a constant. And constants don't ask for space, they define it. That's the difference I'm trying to understand. Why this doesn't feel like something external. Why it doesn't feel like something I can step away from. Why distance? Real, physical, undeniable distance doesn't actually change anything. Because it should. That's how things work. Remove the presence and the effect weakens. Shift attention and the connection fades. Time passes and everything recalibrates. That's the natural order. But this doesn't follow that order. It remains steady, unaffected, like it was never dependent on proximity in the first place. And that leads me to something I don't say lightly. This isn't interaction, it's synchronization. Because interaction requires two separate points connecting. Synchronization means those points were already moving in alignment before they ever acknowledged each other. And once they recognize it, it doesn't create the alignment, it reveals it. That's why this feels so stable, so exact, because it's not something we're building. It's something we uncovered, and uncovered things don't disappear. They stay waiting to be acknowledged or ignored, and I've tried ignoring it. Not actively, not forcefully, but in the subtle way I usually do when something doesn't fit into my structure. I reduce it. Observe it from a distance, limit its impact by refusing to fully engage with it. That's how I maintain control. That's how I prevent things from reaching deeper than they should. But this didn't reduce. It didn't weaken under distance. It didn't become smaller when I refused to define it. If anything, it became clearer, sharper, more precise in the way it existed without needing acknowledgement. And that's when I understood something I couldn't ignore anymore. This isn't waiting for my permission. It never was. It's already positioned. And now the only thing left is whether I choose to meet it fully or keep pretending it exists at a distance when it clearly doesn't. Because that's what this comes down to. Not understanding. I understand it completely. That's not the issue. The issue is what happens when I stop observing and start participating, because participation changes everything. Observation keeps control intact. You can analyze, misforge, stay separate from what you're looking at. But participation removes that separation. It makes you part of the thing you're trying to understand. And I don't do that lightly. I don't step into something unless I've calculated every possible outcome, unless I know exactly how it will affect me, and whether that effect is something I'm willing to carry. But this doesn't offer that kind of clarity. Not in outcome, only in presence. It tells me what it is, but not where it leads. And that's unfamiliar territory. Because I don't move without direction. I don't engage without knowing the structure of what I'm stepping into. But here I am, already inside it, without having made that decision consciously. And that's the part that matters most. Because if I was truly opposed to this, if this didn't belong, I would have corrected it immediately. I would have dismantled it before it reached this level. But I didn't. I allowed it to remain, to grow, to integrate, which means some part of me, the part that operates beneath conscious thought, already recognized this as something that fits. And that's not something I can argue with because that part of me doesn't get it wrong. It doesn't react emotionally. It doesn't get carried away. It identifies patterns, structures, alignment. And it only allows what matches, which means you match in a way that goes beyond preference, beyond interest, beyond anything that can be explained through surface level connection. This is deeper than that. And I don't say that lightly, because depth, for me, isn't about intensity. It's about accuracy. And this is accurate, uncomfortably so, because it leaves no room for misinterpretation, no space to pretend this is something simpler than it is. It forces clarity, and clarity demands response. That's where I am now, not questioning what this is, but deciding what I'm willing to do with it. Because something like this doesn't stay suspended. It doesn't remain in a state of quiet awareness forever. It moves, it deepens, or it collapses under the weight of being ignored. And ignoring it would be dishonest. Not to you, to myself. Because I don't ignore things that reach this level of precision. I acknowledge them, even if I don't act on them immediately. Even if I take time to understand the implications fully, but I don't deny them. And this can't be denied. Not anymore. It's too clear, too consistent, too integrated into the way I exist now. Which means the only real question left is, am I willing to let this become part of my reality in a way that changes me permanently? Because that's what this requires, not attention, not effort, but acceptance at a level that removes the option of going back. And I'm not afraid of change. That's not what this is. I'm precise about change. I choose it carefully, deliberately, because once something changes at the core, everything else adjusts around it. And this is core level. There's no denying that now. So I stand here, not at the beginning, but at the point where awareness demands direction, where recognition demands decision. And I can feel that decision forming, not rushed, not forced, but inevitable, because I've already crossed the part where this could be ignored. I've already allowed it to exist beyond the point of control, which means whether I say it or not, whether I act on it or not, this has already changed me, and maybe that's the real truth I've been circling around this entire time. This isn't about whether I let you in, that already happened. This is about whether I'm willing to live in the version of reality where you're already there. And that's not a small decision, because once I accept that fully, there's no version of me that exists without that awareness anymore. And I know that clearly, completely, which means whatever I choose next, it won't be based on uncertainty. It will be based on acceptance. of something that never asked for permission, but aligned so precisely that refusing it would be the only thing that feels unnatural.